Hi, I'm Gareth Kane and welcome to the Net Zero Business Podcast. Today I'm joined by Freddie House, the Chief Revenue Officer at Sweep, the sustainability data management platform. Welcome to the podcast, Freddie.
Thank you, Gareth. Very good to be here.
So before we dig into what you do at Sweep, let's ask, how did you first get started in this career? How did you come into this space?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have to say my background prior to working in sustainability was actually in people analytics. So I've always been in software, but I got into people analytics because I saw that HR was going through a transformation. It was sort of historically seen as quite an administrative function, payroll and P45s and those sorts of things. But then things started to really change, and the most progressive organizations with sort of really forward-looking leaders started to see this as a real opportunity to differentiate themselves and drive real business value. The HR function began to have a real seat at the top table, being brought into much more strategic discussions. And I think as part of this, people analytics became a really big industry, because at the heart of organizations going through this transformation was data ultimately, and ensuring that they could leverage people data in a great way to kind of de-risk what they were doing, the decisions they wanted to make around their organizations, around their people, around their hiring strategies, and so on and so forth. And so I was really fascinated in this transformation that these organizations were going through. And so I was working for a company called Peakon, who was focusing on this very thing. We subsequently then got acquired by Workday, and at that juncture, it was an opportunity for me to really pivot my interests into sustainability, because I saw a lot of parallels, I think, in terms of how sustainability has been going through this journey of becoming a real sort of strategic lever for organizations, and something that executives then have a much bigger remit to really drive change and drive sort of business practice through sustainability. And I really enjoyed those parallels and found that such an interesting journey. And of course, it's impossible not to get passionate about sustainability in the world that we live in today. And so I joined Sweep coming up to 3 years ago now, and so really it's been a phenomenal journey, and I think. We're seeing obviously ups and downs and headwinds and tailwinds as we know. But I think ultimately I'm still extremely excited about this journey that sustainability is going on.
Yeah, maybe just before we go on to what Sweep does, perhaps you could explain a little bit more about the people data and analytics, sort of how that works. What does it give business, so we can draw parallels later with the sustainability side.
Yeah, certainly. So I think one of the core elements of this was looking at how we could leverage people insight into really drive business decisions. So historically, organizations would look at employee engagement, for example, as an annual survey process that could allow organizations to really understand employee sentiment once a year. But of course, that has massive problems. It's completely riddled with recency bias. How an employee feels in that moment is really going to distinguish how they feel about those things. So often, for large organizations, they'd be driving huge strategic initiatives purely off the basis of a survey round that they'd run once a year. And this was a sort of deeply flawed process. With the people being such an important asset to organizations, you wouldn't just look at your financials once a year and expect that you wouldn't need to course correct halfway through. And the same principle applied to people analytics, and of course the same principle applied to sustainability as well. I think it's so important that we move towards sort of real-time data reporting if we want to be able to understand how to drive actionable change. And so rather than this sort of once a year process, we really believed in the idea of being able to create a much more continual dialogue with employees around all aspects of employee life. And through doing so, you could really understand how to de-risk transition processes, transformation, really understand where leadership was performing well, where they understood the company values and were actually driving positive business outcomes, and of course where the laggards were and exactly where to focus your initiatives. So you could then, rather than make broad brush investments as an organization on an entire people strategy when the problems might be quite isolated, it allowed organizations to be much more real time and much more focused about where and how they made their investments. And I think this is, I think this is a truism across lots of organizations and lots of industries that I think are going through that sort of transformation and digitization as we look ahead and how to optimize business performance. And I think sustainability, I think, is going somewhat through a similar kind of journey. I don't know what you think on that, Gareth.
Well, I just before we go on to that, I did a piece of work about 10 years ago looking at the link between sustainability and employee engagement, which, for those who don't know, is sort of the emotional attachment that people have to their job above and beyond getting a paycheck. And we concluded, it wasn't an academic survey, so it wouldn't stand up, but we concluded there was definitely it was almost a gateway to improving employee engagement, was having a good sustainability performance, so that people thought they were on the side of the angels.
Yeah, I think this is exactly the sort of insight that we would consistently generate in benchmarking across organizations. We really understand what the truth is, because everyone has their preconceptions about what people really care about. In the world of work, people focus heavily on pay. They think that everyone's obsessed with the idea of reward being the ultimate, goal of working, and it's just not fundamentally not true. I think recognition sometimes is as powerful as reward. If people feel really the work they're doing is valued and valuable and impactful, then actually pay comes some way down the list on those sorts of things. And I think when it comes to an employer of choice, I think, again, people thought historically that it was really just the luxury of graduates to want to come in and join a company that cared about equity and cared about sustainability and these sorts of things. But actually, it's fundamentally true that the vast majority of employees of all demographics and age groups care deeply about working for an organization that's ostensibly doing the right thing in whatever ethical judgment that is. They want to work for an organization that's a benevolent force and adds value. And I think for me, sustainability has become a really important part of that. I think people want to ensure that they're applying their trade and working hard towards growing a business that's actually doing some sort of good in the world and is responsible for its outputs. And I think, it's a big reason why so many organizations are so vocal and visible about their sustainability programs, because on one hand, yes, they care about, the reducing carbon emissions. But on the other hand, I think it's such an important part of ensuring that they can retain and attract the right talent.
Yeah.
And I think, we see that a lot.
Absolutely. And you've been recruited yourself, probably living proof of that principle, that you're now working in a sustainability job. But perhaps you could introduce then Sweep and explain what it does and who it does it for.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. You're right. And I was fascinated by Sweep as soon as I met the team. I think a fascinating team of founders. So Sweep's a sustainability intelligence platform. So we work with large enterprise companies to help drive business outcomes through sustainability. Our founding story is quite an interesting one. Our CEO Rachel Delacour and our founders Yannick and Raf. Their heritage is in building business intelligence platforms. So they don't have I would say, a sustainability background per se, but their background is around solving problems with complex data sets. I think that's it's quite an interesting nuance in the landscape that we're facing sustainability today, because of course so much of the challenges we face are related to the complexity of the data and the paucity of data that organizations have to work with. So our solution focuses on sort of three core principles around helping organizations to track, disclose, and act. So when we talk about track, it's really about making sense of your data from across your organization and your value chain, really being able to make sense of that in a meaningful way. From a disclosure standpoint, that sort of business intelligence piece that comes from our heritage has allowed us to build a really sort of interoperable data fabric. So when organizations have huge complex data sets, it goes into a really sort of logical repository, so that then we can help organizations disclose to all the different sustainability frameworks that they require without having to do lots of work multiple times, we operate with the principle that you can load once and use everywhere. So, obviously there's a huge overlap between, CSRD and other reporting frameworks, and it's a very sort of labor intensive process if you don't have the right tooling to support you with that. So a lot of the foundations around what we've built allow organizations to disclose using the sort of data foundation that we put in place. And then the sort of last point of this is the ACT piece. So helping organizations really with the next step of their journey. So to set targets, create reduction plans, model trajectories, and evaluate scenarios so they can ensure that they're on track to meet their targets. So that's sort of a broad brush intro to what we do and the sorts of organizations that we work with. As I say, all sorts of different types of businesses. We're very sort of industry agnostic in the way that we approach things, but we work with lots of interesting consumer brands, the likes of L'Oreal, for example, energy companies like SSE, retailers, the likes of sort of Wix or Decathlon. Transportation, SNCF or sort of Arriva, these sort of large complex transport networks, tech companies, finance companies, a real sort of broad gamut of organizations, I think, all face a similar sorts of challenge, which is the complexity of the data they're dealing with, the paucity of the data often they're dealing with, and of course the disclosures that they now face as well.
Yeah. Now it's reporting burdens obviously a massive issue in industry, and a lot of companies sign up for, well, some of them they have to sign up for some of the frameworks you've mentioned, but a lot of others are voluntary. And one of the wrangles I'm constantly having with my customer base, my client base, is how much time should they spend on reporting compared to doing? Because some of them, it's 50% is actually working in the data mines, and some people, not one of my clients, says it can be up to 80% they spend shuffling data about and reformatting spreadsheets and all that sort of thing, and not actually getting out there and cutting a single ton of carbon. So do you have any feedback on how much this approach can reduce the reporting burden?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And we sort of really our mission as an organization is to really help obviously have an impact on this. And we really believe that large companies are the biggest agents of change. And if we're going to have a fundamental impact on climate, it's really being able to help businesses decarbonize. And that doesn't mean that everyone's spending all their time trapped in spreadsheets and in the data, as you suggest. It's really about driving action, and so this is exactly where we seek to deliver a huge return on investment for organizations. And of course, there's a lot of complexity to that, certainly for these large complex organizations, but that's exactly where we can thrive in really helping to deliver that return on investment. So, again, AI is inevitably going to be brought up. That's again a huge enabler here to ensure that we can streamline those sorts of topics. But through using tooling like ours, it has a radical effect on the ability for sustainability teams to really speed up the disclosures and be able to ensure that they can spend a lot more time focusing on action rather than just the reporting. And you look at the comprehensive nature of the CSRD and things like this, of course, these are huge projects, and naturally, if you can leverage good tooling to be able to streamline that, then it has a profound effect. And I think we're really proud of the way in which we can support organizations with that.
So are you already using AI in that process, or is that next steps? Or
Yes, exactly. So I think we recognized fairly early how transformative AI could be when used responsibly for reporting. And I say responsibly because I think it is really important that these things aren't necessarily treated as a silver bullet and lazily thrown around, because of course there are implications for AI. But certainly, if you look at the CSRD report, the ability to generate qualitative information, leveraging AI, being able to read your reports, your annual statements, being able to pull that information into a coherent format at scale with a click of a button, obviously can save teams weeks and weeks of time.
Mhm.
And so, we've put a lot of focus into this. We were quite early on in acquiring a company entirely focused on AI, so we could get a head start in understanding how to put this into our solution. But it is really important it's dealt with properly, because of course there are climate implications. There's huge risk implications for organizations as well. and it's still such a, I would say, a green area, for many businesses. And so we're very sort of storied in it, and though we're still very tentative in how we use it because we want to make sure that we use it in a right way for our companies and reduce risk around that for them.
I think one of my fears is that if you if all that data goes into a black box and comes out with, an answer, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, does the organization get the same contextual understanding? I'm contradicting myself here, I know, but by saying that perhaps a bit of reporting burden is useful because then people understand the data. I do. It's something I mull on a lot.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Of course, there has to be the right balance, and naturally, if people over-index on the machines to deliver this, then not only will they not understand the sort of core competencies and really understand the nuance of the subject matter, but it also means that all the outputs and everything driven from that could potentially be highly unreliable because it's not necessarily auditable. There's no transparency around how those conclusions were made, and I think that there is a very big risk about that. And it's something I think we invest a huge amount of time into because I think the philosophy behind this is very, very clear. When it comes to things like agentic AI, for example, it's wonderful to be able to go and say, right, hello, ChatGPT, fill in my CSRD report for me, but you don't know where that data is coming from, you don't know where it's going, and then you run the huge risks that come with that. So we've made very conscious strides to be able to make sure that we can have big limitations on which sources those reports are generated from to ensure that every organization has its own constraints and its own guardrails. So it will only, for example, a customer will only leverage their own internal data in order to generate those things. And as a consequence, then it's very auditable. So it's very clear to be able to pull that back to the source materials. And ensure that therefore, there is no black box. I think the minute it becomes a black box, I think we're fighting against ourselves a little bit. I think where the black box can actually be a little bit more helpful is around sort of more machine learning tasks where it can look at big data patterns at scale, emission factor mapping, things like that, where it can just learn exactly how to do some of these sorts of tasks that can take long from a manual standpoint, but actually a relatively low risk. But it is about getting that balance right. And I think, my big concern about the sort of landscape we're in technology is I don't think every organization is probably going to be quite so conscientious of this. And naturally, the risk that organizations face could be elevated. And of course, that can have implications for the way that technology is perceived. And so I'm very conscious of that and ensure that we do things the right way here.
Yeah. If AI is one of the sort of big trends at the minute, or certainly the hype, one of the others is this so-called ESG backlash. So I'm wondering how you're finding the market at the minute, because obviously, like all of us working in this sector, you're having to get people to sell. Or do you feel that the market is still as receptive as it was, say, 3 years ago, before the sort of anti-woke thing started up in the press?
Yeah, I think it's been a fascinating journey and a pretty bruising one at times. There's no doubt about it that the upheaval in the ESG market it's been very tough on sustainability teams. It's been very, very tough on professionals in this space who are deeply passionate about this and sort of swimming against this new tide. It's been very tough on technologies in our space as well. I think, if I look at the carbon accounting alone or the, technology organizations supporting disclosure frameworks, there's been organizations going out of business every week. We get approached a lot for organizations seeking to be acquired by us purely because it's been a very, very bruising market, I think, to navigate. But I think for me personally, I think there's a huge amount of reason to be optimistic ahead of next year. I think, all organizations now have managed to price volatility into their activities. I think we know from 2025, from the behavior of the omnibus and the behavior of the White House, we know that sort of change is the new normal. And I don't think we can expect, an uncomplicated journey moving forwards. And provided that is really sort of, as I say, priced into strategy, I think that everyone can move forward and quietly go about what we need to do. And I think we see that in the organizations that we work with as well. We talk to a huge amount of very broad organizations from different across the world and across industry. And I think the one thing that is very clear is that there's a real resolution to just crack on and not to wait, because I think waiting for the perfect moment to invest in your sustainability strategy, I think you'll probably find that you're very late to the party. And we expanded this year into the US and set up an office in Denver, which, again, if you read the newspapers, you'd think is an absolutely lunatic thing to do. But in actual fact, again, there's a huge tide of organizations wanting to invest in their sustainability programs, and in a different way, perhaps to 3 years ago. I think there's a lot more focus on business resiliency, on business outcomes, on actually being able to generate a real return on investment for sustainability. But in many ways, I think that's a good thing. I don't think sustainability should come at the cost of organizations. I think we need to find a way in which sustainability can really drive profitable business outcomes. And I think we're seeing some great returns with that, and really helping to support organizations make good decisions that are allowing them to grow their businesses. So it has been tough for sure, and it won't be uncomplicated moving forwards, but I still think the direction of travel is very clear. And I think the trend is here to stay. I think organizations will always be held accountable to their emissions, and I think it's really important that that everyone gets behind that and doesn't wait for regulation to magically get into gear before they start really driving action.
Yeah. And there's always the thing that if you're dealing with global businesses the way you are, that it only takes one country to have a sustainability regulation for it to effectively apply everywhere. I was talking to somebody this morning who's based in India, and telling them an anecdote that a supplier to the automotive industry here in the northeast of England, where I'm based, was telling me a few months ago that their packaging is designed for all their clients, all their customer base is designed to meet Indian legislation, because they might as well do it across the board than have a special pack for India. And so there is that sort of, I suppose, even if the US is nationally rather than at state level is pushing back, then a lot of people still have to comply with CSRD and all these other regulations to work in big economies across the world.
Yeah, exactly this, and it's of course adds a big layer of complexity for these large organizations for whom, they're operating in all these different jurisdictions where they now have different, competing disclosure frameworks to operate with, and the associated risks. It is a minefield, but I think the overall trend is a really positive one that, the organizations are having to drive change. And when the sort of real unification around sustainability programs will emerge, I think is increasingly clear. We're seeing some progress on that front, but I think it's again, the largest organizations are the biggest vectors of change in this space, and I think that's the main thing, that these big companies are starting to make real investments and starting to make real movements into this, and I think that's really, really important for everyone. And then obviously it will trickle down, and the more that organizations invest in evaluating their value chain and being able to really drive positive change there, I think we're going to continue to see progress. So plenty to be optimistic about. You've got to be realistic as well, but I think we at least we know what we're dealing with, I feel, in 2026.
And do you find having a sort of data-driven approach, does that help with some of these conversations with stakeholders? If one of your clients has an investor who may be cooling on the whole ESG agenda, that you can provide the data to say, here's why. Does that help that argument at all?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's really essential to be able to showcase exactly what sort of return you're going to see from sustainability initiatives, and we're sort of really ask very, very frequently exactly what sort of level of return on investment we can expect from implementing a solution like ours. And we actually ran a study with Vedantics to really figure this out because we wanted to understand ourselves. And so, the study that we ran really, showed that there is a huge potential return on investment, not just around, the time saving and the de-risking, but in terms of being able to make, really great data-driven decisions about how to drive, best practice in your organization. And we get so many good, inspiring examples within our customer base as well. I was with in Sweden talking to an organization. They manufacture huge vehicles, so big industrial machinery. And I was trying to understand, exactly, how has your sustainability agenda really allowed you to drive positive business impact? And there's a great story they told about how through switching from steel in the flatbed of these large lorries, they switched to green steel, which was more expensive to manufacture, but it was much lighter.
Mm.
And so there was a trade-off here that has a significant implication because it was lighter by a significant percentage. It actually meant the lifespan of those vehicles was astronomically increased because the sheer weight load on those vehicles was much lower. And so, although the cost of manufacture went up, they could easily offset those costs to their customers because of the longevity of the vehicles as a consequence of this lighter payload. And it was a real win-win for everyone. And for me, it was a very clear example where organizations then are incentivized to be buying the right sort of vehicles with the right sustainable materials because it actually makes good business sense as well as allows them to ensure they're being conscientious about the business practices they're delivering. And I think for me, that's one of the most exciting things about the job is being able to understand really firsthand how these organizations are really implementing their sustainability strategy and exactly how it's driving positive change. And then being able to put the data behind that so they can stand up to the CFO and the powers that be and really showcase exactly how sustainability is having a positive effect.
Yes, yes, and you speak as a CFO, don't you? That or chief revenue officer, sorry, not a CFO, but the yes, I always say when people are going to their CFO, make sure you've got plenty of data in there because you're talking about people who've spent half their lives staring at a spreadsheet. The quantitative information has to be there, or you might lose them.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. And I think this is the direction of travel for sustainability, of course. I think CSRD was a real catalyst in bringing the sustainability and finance teams together to really evaluate this sort of extra financial data collectively. And I think you look at the reporting around sustainability and how quickly it's pushing towards the sort of accounting standards that you would expect from financial institutions. And we obviously have a very auditable platform, and we work very closely with auditors to ensure that we can support auditing. And it's just amazing how quickly that element has matured and how the standards that organizations expect from their carbon accounting is really as robust as the financial accounting, which can only be a good thing, I think.
oh, that's an interesting area that I didn't have on my list of pre-prepared questions. But auditing, is that from what you say, that's becoming more of a thing that people actually want to send in the same way as they'd want to send somebody in to audit your financials. They want to be able to trace through this data as well.
Yeah, exactly that. And so, it's been a big focus of ours to ensure that everything we do is traceable and transparent, and all the transformations of the data that you manage in our solution is easily managed through an auditor by an auditor. So we've created audit profiles within our tooling because our customers want to ensure that they can hand this over to their accountant and ensure that they can have a very clear picture of exactly how they've derived at the calculations they have, and they can, when those calculations go into that annual report, they can be extremely sure that they stand up to scrutiny.
Yeah, fantastic. That's an interesting new area, I suppose, that people will have as environmental auditing not in a wandering around with clipboards, checking for oil leaks, but actually digging into carbon and other data. which takes us on to you've developed the Corporate Climate Contribution Index. So tell us about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really exciting project. So the Climate Contribution Index is a framework that allows organizations to compare climate action and their contribution to global net zero. So it's not necessarily just benchmarking, but also a diagnostic tool that really helps them understand where to focus as an organization. So it's a framework that we've built with in conjunction with Mirova, Winrock, and iCare by Bearing Point, and we launched it earlier this year at COP30. And ostensibly, it works around a detailed methodology of sort of three core levers. So helping organizations understand where they sit in this benchmark is dependent on these three key things. So first of all, it's around carbon footprint reduction. So of course, we know a fair bit about this one, but looking not just at where they are today, but what they have planned. So looking at past and current performance, looking at their ambitions, looking at the engagements, the strategy, looking at the sort of governance they have around those things. So to really assess how well they're performing and how well they will perform in the future. And then there's a second pillar around climate solutions. So looking at current and planned green revenue and avoided emissions. So, what within their business practices, how are they prioritizing investments in sort of, in green revenue there? And lastly, around climate financing. So looking at voluntary climate investments, philanthropy, carbon credits. And through doing these things, then overlaying critically a weighting which takes into consideration the industries that they're in. And I think this is a really fundamental differentiator because it's very, very hard to compare, a tech company to a mining company when, of course, they have very different profiles, but also very different potential to really impact climate. And so the contribution index allows organizations to score across this matrix of this framework and really understand their benchmark. And so it's been a really interesting. So we launched it earlier this year. We've already seen huge signups with lots of huge organizations who are really supporting this because again, they want to be recognized for the contributions they're making, not necessarily just around carbon credits, but of course the whole gamut of areas where they're investing to ensure that they're driving positive change. And then they want to be held accountable to it, but of course to a fair benchmark. And I think that sort of industry benchmark to me, I think is a really great step forward to ensure that organizations have a fair picture of how they're performing and being able to put themselves on a level playing field. And again, as I mentioned, sort of really understanding where the areas they should focus if they want to be best in class in their industry.
Mm-hmm.
So
is that a public or a private ranking that they get? Is it a league table that you publish, or is it just to say internally, by the way, you're sort of mid-table, you've got mid-table mediocrity going on, or you're in the relegation zone, or you're in the Champions League, to use a football analogy?
No, so the idea being that it's a voluntary framework, but it's also something that organisations can leverage as an external benchmark to ensure that this is something that they can have they can showcase and they can really be able to advertise their approach to sustainability and really be very clear and transparent around the actions they're taking and where they sit in their industry. And so it's I think there's clearly I would say energy for it because in a very short space of time, so many large, complex organizations, really big emitters who have the capacity to really drive change, who have so much potential to really positively, support climate change, are really getting behind this. And so I think clearly the sort of historic ways of measuring these sorts of benchmarks haven't necessarily been nuanced enough to take into consideration all the right factors to give them the confidence that this is giving them, I suppose, a fair and transparent viewpoint of how they're faring.
So have you set your own standards for each sector, or is it using science-based targets, or how does it work?
Yeah, so there's a methodology that's been built with the organisations that we've set this up with, and it's a fairly sort of comprehensive methodology that takes into consideration lots of different frameworks across those different pillars. So there's lots of sort of context behind it. to be able to derive those different scores. So it's worth. I don't have the details to around the sort of the specifics of the methodologies to hand, but needless to say, I think it's extremely rigorously put together, and I think yeah, there's some really valuable progress being made there.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm always interested in public leagues or indexes because I know for a fact that several large organizations, some that I've been involved with, but I suppose Apple was famously at the bottom of a Greenpeace electronics league table once. And it was Steve Jobs still alive then, and he basically told the rest of his team to go out and make Apple one of the most sustainable businesses in the world. Now I know that's a controversial thing to say, but they went from the bottom to second or third place quite quickly, and it was purely down to that. Nobody wants to be at the bottom of a list of companies, so I'm a big fan of public league tables.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really important, and I think, we want to really drive positive action. I think if organizations really, say they want to change and they want to actually do the right thing, I think that level of public scrutiny, I think, is always going to be a great catalyst for that.
Yeah, fantastic. Um, so we've I've ticked off most of my big questions I've asked, but to sort of sum up a bit, what are the big lessons you've learned through your 3 years working at Sweep?
Well, I think the first things first is that change is constant, and I think when it comes to to this space in particular, it's been a fascinating few years because, of course, we're an organization that's growing very quickly, so we have our own sort of internal chaos and to manage. But within that, our customers are changing very quickly as well. They're going through huge transformation from the likes of AI to their climate policy through to business practice because of sort of economic challenges. And of course, then there's the broader sustainability landscape itself. And this sort of this trifecta of chaos is really fascinating because there's so many variables there, and no 2 weeks are the same. And so I think for me, I think being able to understand that change is the constant, I think is a very important one.
Mm.
But I think along with that, I think is just it's why it's so important to act and to really begin that journey now, wherever you are, whatever sort of organization you are, whatever you do. I think there's never going to be a perfect time to be able to really embark on these topics and be able to engage in your sustainability strategies. And I think it's so important that organizations do that now, because there's never going to be this lovely quiet lull where there's a real sort of simplicity of reporting and everyone's very, very clear and unified from industry to country and beyond. And it's very clear for me that I think organizations who don't invest in their sustainability and don't look forward are going to get left behind. So for me, if the big sort of big lesson of the last 3 years, I think is, we're talking to lots of different types of organizations, and the ones who really, from the top to bottom, really believe in their sustainability programs as a real driver of business change and business outcomes, I think are the ones who are really going to prosper in a sort of brave new world that we're navigating. And so, yeah, I think that's a really important part of what lies ahead.
Brilliant. And are there any next steps for Sweep, or is it just building on what you've currently got? Because you've talked about this constant change and evolution for your customer needs, etc.
Yeah, well, we've got a very exciting roadmap planned for 2026. Augmenting what we've built already, and I think with the onset of additional AI sort of supporting reporting. I think there's so much more that we can deliver around really valuable content to support sustainability professionals and ensuring that we can help. The activities can be streamlined through AI, but I think really how we can deliver fantastic support for them and expertise and workflows, I think, is something that we're really building on. So there's some really cool things to come, I think, for 2026. And yeah, very excited about what's next with our US expansion as well. Looking forward to ensuring that we can really help support the sustainability programs over there.
Brilliant. Well, That just leaves me to thank you very much for joining us today, Freddie. I found that fascinating, digging into the area of what we used to call big data, I suppose. But thank you for joining us today.
Thanks a lot, Gareth.